The land was made of silence and distance. In the Wyoming high country of 1884, the wind was the only thing that spoke with any authority, and it spoke of emptiness. It planed the rock faces smooth and bleached the bones of last year's cattle pale as sin. For a man like Silas, a man who had emptied himself of words and wants, it was a fitting place to be. He was 41 years old, but his eyes held the geography of a much older man, mapped with lines that spoke of sun and a sorrow so deep it had become a part of his bones. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Ghost for its pale coat and quiet tread, moved with a steady, ground-eating walk that had carried them across 3 territories. They were not going anywhere in particular. That was the point. To be in motion was to be away from the past, and the past was a fixed point on a map Silas never wanted to see again. A small plot of land in Colorado with 2 wooden markers on it, one for his wife Martha and a smaller one for his boy Samuel. The fever had taken them in the space of a single week, leaving behind a silence in his cabin far more profound than the one he now sought in the wilderness. He had been a rancher. He had been a husband and a father. He had been a man who believed in the promises of hard work and a good season. Now he was just a man in motion, his possessions worn down to the essentials, a bedroll, a rifle, a skillet, and a store of memories he fought daily to keep buried. His hands, resting on the worn pommel of his saddle, were raw at the knuckles, not from labor, but from the relentless cold. They were capable hands, hands that knew how to set a bone, fix a wheel, or soothe a fevered brow. They were useless hands now, with nothing to build and no one to hold. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, a color that seemed to mock the muted grays and browns of the earth. He crested a low rise and saw it. A cabin tucked into a shallow draw, looking small and defenseless against the immense landscape. It was little more than a soddy, its roof sagging like a tired man's shoulders. A thin, hesitant wisp of smoke, almost invisible against the vastness, curled from the mud and stick chimney. It was the smoke that felt wrong. It was too weak, too uncertain for the coming cold of a Wyoming afternoon. It was the kind of fire a child would make, or someone who was running out of wood. Silas pulled Ghost to a halt. His first instinct, honed by years of self-imposed isolation, was to ride on. Another man's trouble was not his own. He had paid his dues to sorrow and had no wish to take on anyone else's share. But he stayed, his gaze fixed on the small homestead. There was no movement, no cattle in the makeshift corral, no chickens scratching in the dirt, just the cabin and the pale, trembling smoke. It was the stillness of a place holding its breath. He nudged Ghost forward, his approach slow and deliberate. He was not a man who startled easily, but he did not wish to startle others. As he drew closer, he saw them. 2 small figures near a sprawling woodpile that was mostly made up of branches too thick for a child to break and too green to burn well. They were girls. One was taller, standing with a rigid posture that spoke of a burden too heavy for her frame. The other was small, a bundle of patched wool, half hidden behind her sister. The older girl held a small hatchet. She was trying to split a log, bringing the tool down with a desperate, clumsy force that did little more than scar the wood. Each swing was a testament to her futility. Silas was close enough now to see her face. She was maybe 12. Her expression a stark combination of fierce determination and bone-deep exhaustion. Her hair was the color of dusty corn silk, pulled back in a severe braid. Her face was smudged with dirt and pale, with a hunger that was more than just a day old. The little one, no older than 7, clutched a worn cornhusk doll and watched her sister with wide, frightened eyes. Silas stopped his horse a dozen yards away. He did not want to loom over them. He swung down from the saddle, his movements stiff from the cold. The dry grass crunched under his resoled boots. The older girl stopped her work. She turned to face him, planting her feet and raising the hatchet just slightly, not as a weapon she could truly wield, but as a clear and desperate warning. Her chin was up, her eyes narrowed. They were gray eyes, clear and startlingly direct. They were taking stock eyes, assessing his worn coat, his lean frame, the rifle in its scabbard, the intent on his face. She was not just a child facing a stranger. She was a sentry at her post. "That's a heavy work for a girl," Silas said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grating together. The girl did not answer. She simply watched him, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of the hatchet. The smaller girl whimpered and pressed her face into her sister's back. "Your folks home?" Silas asked, keeping his tone even gentle. The girl's gaze did not waver. "They're gone." The words were flat, devoid of emotion, yet they hung in the cold air with the weight of a tombstone. "Gone where?" he pressed, though he thought he already knew. The wrongness of the place was beginning to take shape. "Gone to the Lord," she said, her voice a little unsteady now. "The lung sickness. Pa first. Then Ma 3 days ago. 3 days." He looked at the weak smoke, at the girl's pale face, at the way her sister clung to her. He looked at the useless woodpile. 3 days without food, most likely. 3 days of a 12-year-old girl trying to hold the world together for her little sister while their mother lay dead inside the cabin. He imagined she had done what she had to, dragged her mother out, covered her with stones. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. He saw it then. Not just 2 orphaned girls. He saw the truth of her character in the set of her jaw. He saw the fierce, unyielding love in the way she shielded her sister. He saw the quiet competence in the pathetic but orderly state of their small world. The wood. Stacked, however poorly, the younger girl's face clean despite the smudge of tears on her cheek. This was not a child who had been beaten by circumstance. This was a child who was fighting it with everything she had, and she was losing. In her exhausted, defiant eyes, he saw a mirror of his own past, of the fight he had lost. The urge to turn, to mount his horse and ride away from the gravity of this new sorrow, was immense. It was a physical pull, a siren song of self-preservation. He had nothing left to give. He was a hollow man. But then the little girl peeked out from behind her sister, and her eyes, wide and dark with a fear that knew no pride, landed on him. In that moment the choice was gone. He could not leave them to the wind and the wolves. He could not. The part of him that was a father, the part he thought long dead and buried, stirred. He took a slow step forward, holding his hands out, palms open to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "I have some food in my saddlebags." The older girl watched him, her mind clearly working, weighing the danger of a stranger against the certainty of starvation. Her shoulders slumped just a fraction, the briefest surrender, the hatchet lowered. "What's your name?" Silas asked. "Ilara," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is Maeve." "Silas," he replied. He walked past them, his steps measured, and went to the woodpile. He took the hatchet from her unresisting hand. The handle was smooth and worn. He chose a piece of dry, seasoned pine from the bottom of the pile, something her father had likely cut before he fell ill. With 2 clean, efficient strokes, he split it into kindling. He worked for 10 minutes, not speaking, the rhythmic crack of the wood splitting the silence. He created a neat pile of firewood that would last them a few days. Ilara watched him, her expression unreadable. She had not moved. When he was done, he picked up an armload of the wood and walked toward the cabin. "Let's get a proper fire going," he said over his shoulder. She hesitated for only a second before gathering Maeve's small hand in her own and following him into the dim, cold interior of the sod house. The cabin was 1 room, meticulously clean but heartbreakingly bare. A single bed frame stood against one wall, the mattress stripped. 2 small pallets of blankets were arranged near the stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table with 2 stools stood in the center of the room. The larder was, as he had suspected, empty save for a handful of withered potatoes and a half-empty tin of salt. The air was thick with the lingering scent of sickness and grief. Silas did not comment on the poverty or the sorrow. He laid the fire with practiced hands, and soon a steady, hungry flame was licking up the chimney, pushing back the cold. He went back out to his horse and returned with his supplies, a slab of bacon, a bag of flour, coffee, and a small sack of dried apples. The girls watched his every move, their eyes wide and fixed on the food. He sliced the bacon and set it to sizzle in his skillet, the smell filling the small cabin with a scent so rich and full of life it felt like a prayer. He made a quick dough of flour and water and fried it in the hot grease. He boiled some of the dried apples until they were soft. He did it all with a quiet, deliberate economy of motion. It was work for his hands, and it kept him from thinking too much. He served them on 2 tin plates, placing them on the table. "Eat," he said. They ate. They did not speak, did not look up. They ate with a desperate, silent intensity that spoke of days of gnawing hunger. Silas poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the wall by the fire, watching them. Color was slowly returning to their faces, a faint pink blush under the grime. When they were finished, Ilara carefully wiped her plate clean with her finger. She looked at him, her gray eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, mister," she whispered. Silas gave a short, sharp nod. He looked around the small, empty cabin. He looked out the open door at the vast, indifferent landscape stretching to the horizon. There was no one coming for them. The nearest town, Jericho Springs, was a hard day's ride away, and it was little more than a speck on the map. Leaving them here was a death sentence. Taking them to town and leaving them with the preacher or the sheriff felt like a betrayal of the promise he had made to himself. When he took the hatchet from her hand, he knew what he had to do. The knowledge settled in him not with a sense of righteous purpose, but with the heavy, unchangeable weight of fact. His drifting was over. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. He looked at Alara, whose gaze was once again wary, questioning what would come next. "Get your things," he said, his voice low but clear. "Whatever your mother would have wanted you to keep." Alara's eyes widened. "Where are we going?" "With me," he said. It was not a question or a suggestion. It was the only answer. He walked to the door and looked back at them. Maeve was clutching her doll, her eyes fixed on him. Alara stood frozen, a storm of fear and hope and confusion on her young face. "You have a coat?" he asked Alara. She nodded. "Put it on and find one for your sister. The wind is sharp." He turned to his horse. He heard shuffling behind him as Alara moved to obey. He untied his bedroll and rearranged his gear, making room. When he turned back, they were standing in the doorway, bundled in worn, oversized coats. Alara held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Maeve clutched her doll. They looked like two small, frightened birds about to be swept up by the wind. He put his hands on his hips and surveyed the situation. Alara was sturdy enough, but Maeve was too small to hold on for a long ride. He walked over and knelt in front of the little one. "I'm going to put you up front with me," he said gently. "You'll be safe there." Maeve looked at her sister for permission. Alara gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Silas lifted the girl, who weighed almost nothing, and settled her in front of the saddle. She was stiff with fear. He then mounted Ghost, his movements fluid and sure. He reached a hand down to Alara. "You'll have to ride up behind me," he said. She took his hand. Her own was small and cold, but her grip was firm. He pulled her up, and she settled behind the cantle, her small arms wrapping tentatively around his waist. He could feel the slight tremor running through her body. He did not look back at the sod cabin, at the fresh mound of stones he knew was just over the rise. There was nothing there for them now. He nudged Ghost into a walk, heading east toward Jericho Springs. The two small bodies pressed against him, one in front and one behind, were a strange and unfamiliar weight. For the first time in 5 years, he was responsible for someone other than himself. The thought was terrifying, and in a small, quiet corner of his hollowed-out heart, it felt something like coming home. Jericho Springs was less a town and more a stubborn argument with the prairie. It consisted of a single dusty street flanked by a dozen wooden buildings. A general store, a livery, a saloon, a smithy, and a handful of houses. It was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. Silas knew the type. He'd passed through 100 towns just like it. He rode straight to the livery. The owner, a burly man with a kind face and a beard the color of iron filings, came out to meet him. "Just one horse?" the man asked, his eyes taking in the unusual sight of Silas and the two girls. "For now," Silas said, swinging down. He carefully lifted Maeve to the ground, her legs unsteady. Then he helped Alara dismount. "I'll need him fed and watered, and I need to know if there's a place to rent. Something small." The liveryman, whose name was Jebediah, stroked his beard and looked at the girls. He saw their worn clothes, their pinched faces. His gaze was shrewd but not unkind. "There's the old Miller cabin, edge of town. Ain't much, but the roof is sound. Mr. Croft at the general store handles it." He paused. "You their pa?" "No," Silas said simply. The word felt both true and false. "I'm seeing to them." Jebediah nodded slowly, accepting the explanation for what it was. "Enough. Croft can be a sharp one. Watch yourself." Silas thanked him, and with a girl holding each of his hands, he walked down the street. The townspeople they passed stopped to stare. A lone rider, with two strange children, was an event in a place where nothing ever happened. Silas ignored their gazes. He was focused on the two small hands in his. Alara's was calloused and tense. Maeve's was soft and trusting. Mr. Croft was a small man with a large ledger and eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating sums. He looked up from his desk as they entered the general store, his gaze lingering on the girls with a sour disapproval. "Looking for something?" Croft asked, his voice thin and reedy. "Jebediah at the livery said you handle the Miller cabin," Silas stated. Croft's eyes narrowed. "I do, for respectable folk." He looked pointedly at Silas's worn gear and the girl's ragged appearance. "I have money for a month's rent," Silas said. placing a few worn coins on the counter. It was nearly all he had left. Croft counted the coins twice. It's $1 a week, paid in advance. No credit. This is for 4 weeks, Silas said, his voice flat. Reluctantly, Croft swept the money into a drawer and produced a rusty key. No trouble, he warned. I hear of any trouble, you're out. Silas took the key without a word and led the girls back out into the street. The Miller cabin was exactly what Jebediah had said it was. Not much. It was one room, with a packed earth floor and walls that let the wind in through a dozen small cracks. But it had a stove, a table, and 2 built-in bunks. It was a shelter. It was a start. The first few weeks were a quiet rhythm of work and necessity. Silas found work with Jebediah, mucking stalls, repairing harnesses, and doing odd jobs that required a strong back and capable hands. He was a good worker, steady, quiet, and reliable. He never complained and did more than he was asked. Jebediah paid him a fair wage at the end of each week, and Silas would walk to Croft's store to buy flour, beans, and occasionally a piece of salt pork. Alara, with a solemn efficiency that was both astonishing and heartbreaking in one so young, took over the cabin. She stuffed the cracks in the walls with mud and grass. She scrubbed the floor until it was clean. She learned to make their meager rations stretch, producing meals of beans and biscuits that were plain but filling. She was the silent mistress of their small, precarious household. Maeve, in the safety of this new routine, began to thaw. The deep fear in her eyes was slowly replaced by a child's curiosity. She would follow Silas to the livery and watch him work, her expression serious as she observed the way he stitched leather or calmed a nervous horse. Sometimes, Silas would look up and find her small face peeking around the doorframe, and he would feel a strange ache in his chest, a phantom limb of fatherhood. One evening he came back to the cabin to find her crying quietly in her bunk. Her cornhusk doll, her last link to her mother, had come apart. The husks were frayed, the small yarn face unraveled. Alara was trying to comfort her, but Maeve's grief was absolute. Silas sat down on the edge of the bunk. He took the ruined doll and examined it under the lamplight. I can fix it, he said. He spent the next hour working with a needle and some thread from Alara's small mending kit. His large, rough hands moved with surprising delicacy. He restitched the body, wound new yarn for the hair, and even used a bit of charcoal to draw the eyes and mouth back on. When he was done, the doll was sturdier than before. He handed it back to Maeve. She took it, her eyes wide with wonder. She hugged it tight and looked up at him. Thank you, she whispered. She then did something that startled him. She leaned forward and gave him a quick, shy hug around his neck before burrowing back under her blankets, clutching the mended doll. Silas sat there for a long moment, the ghost of that small embrace lingering on his skin. He looked over at Alara, who was watching him from the table. A silent understanding passed between them. It was a look that acknowledged the small, fragile thing they were building together in this drafty cabin. It was not a family, not yet, but it was something. The quiet conversations began in the evenings after the supper plates were cleared. They were never planned. They would emerge from the silence, small offerings of the past laid carefully on the table between them. My pa, he could build anything, Alara said one night, staring into the fire in the stove. He built our cabin from the sod up, said it was warmer than wood. A soddy's good shelter, Silas agreed. Takes a strong back to build one. Another night, as he was cleaning his rifle, he spoke without looking up. My son, Samuel, he wanted a horse of his own more than anything. A little gray pony he saw at a fair. Alara stopped her mending. She waited, knowing there was more. He was 7 when he died, Silas said, his voice quiet. He said nothing more, and she did not ask. But the name Samuel now existed in the small space they shared. It was a piece of his history given to her for safekeeping. They were building a life not with grand pronouncements, but with these small, steady acts of care and shared memory. He bought Alara a new ribbon for her hair. She began saving him the heel of the bread, which she knew he preferred. They communicated in a language of gestures, of anticipating one another's needs. A cup of water brought without asking. A coat brushed free of dust. These were the bricks and mortar of their new foundation. The town, for the most part, left them alone. Jebediah became a quiet ally, often sending Silas home with an extra piece of meat or a sack of oats, claiming it was part of his wages. But Mr. Croft's disapproval was a constant simmering presence. Every time Silas went into the store, Croft would watch him with his cold, calculating eyes. He would make comments just loud enough for others to hear. Strange, a man like that taking in 2 girls. He'd say to another customer, "No blood relation, it ain't proper." The whispers started to spread. Silas felt the change in the way people looked at him on the street. The initial curiosity had curdled into suspicion. Women would pull their children a little closer when he passed. Men in the saloon would stop talking when he entered to buy a beer after a long week. His work. He was an outsider, and his situation was irregular. He and the girls were a puzzle the town could not solve, and they feared what they could not understand. The external test, when it came, happened on a cold Saturday afternoon in Croft's store. Silas had come in with both girls to buy their weekly supplies. Maeve was holding his hand, while Alara was carefully selecting a bag of beans. The store was crowded with ranchers and their wives in for the weekend. Croft stood behind his counter, a smug look on his face. He had been waiting for an audience. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet store. "If it isn't the happy little family." Silas did not rise to the bait. He placed his items on the counter. "Just this," he said. Croft ignored the goods. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with false concern. "You know, Silas, people are talking. A man of your history, a drifter, living with 2 young girls. The circuit judge will be through here next month. He takes a dim view of improper arrangements. He might see fit to place these children in a proper institution. For their own good, of course." The threat was clear. The word institution hung in the air like a death sentence. Silas felt Alara stiffen beside him. He felt Maeve's hand tighten its grip on his. He looked around the store. He saw suspicion on some faces, pity on others, but judgment on most. He turned his full attention back to Croft. He did not raise his voice. He did not move, save for placing his body just slightly in front of the girls, shielding them. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, but it cut through the murmuring in the store like a razor. "Their parents are dead," he said, stating a simple fact. "They had been alone for 3 days when I found them. They were starving." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I took them in because it was the right thing to do. I feed them. I keep them warm. I am seeing to them. There is nothing improper about that." He looked directly at Croft, his gaze unyielding. "They are good girls. They are honest and they work hard. And they have suffered enough loss without you threatening to tear apart the only home they have left." A silence fell over the store, thick and heavy. Croft, flustered by the direct, quiet force of Silas's words, sputtered, "It's not for you to decide what's right. It's a matter for the law. Then let the law decide." A new voice boomed from the back of the store. It was Jebediah. He walked forward, his large frame parting the crowd. He came to stand beside Silas. "I've known this man for 3 months. He's the hardest worker I've ever had. He's honest to a fault, and I've seen him with these girls. He's a better father to them in a few weeks than some men are in a lifetime." Jebediah turned his glare on Croft. "You, on the other hand, Croft, you'd see these children shipped off to some miserable orphanage just to satisfy your own mean spirit. We all know the kind of man you are." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. The tide of public opinion, so easily swayed by suspicion, was now turning back just as quickly in the face of simple declarative decency. Croft's face turned a mottled red. He had been beaten, not by force but by character. He sullenly tallied up Silas's goods. Silas paid, gathered his supplies, and, without another word, led the girls out of the store. He walked them back to the cabin, his mind racing. Croft had lost the battle, but the war was not over. The threat of the circuit judge was real. Their fragile life together rested on a foundation of goodwill, and that was no foundation at all. He had to make it permanent. He had to make it legal. That evening, after Maeve was asleep in her bunk, Silas sat down at the table across from Alara. The lantern cast a warm, flickering glow on her serious face. She was mending one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat. He cleared his throat. "Alara." She looked up, her gray eyes watchful. "What Mr. Croft said today, about the judge. He was right about one thing. Our arrangement, it's not official. Someone with a mind to could make trouble for us. They could take you and Maeve away." He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but she kept her composure. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice calm. This was the hardest part. The words felt foreign in his mouth. He was a man of action, of practical solutions. This was a matter of the heart, dressed in the language of the law. "There is a way," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "A way to make it so no one can ever separate us. I could adopt you, both of you. The judge could make it legal. You would be my daughters. You would carry my name. He laid the offer on the table between them, plain and unadorned. It was everything he had to give: a name, protection, a promise of permanence. He finished, "I would be proud to have you as my daughters, to give you my name if you would have it." Alara put down her sewing. She looked at him, her taking stock eyes searching his face. She was not just looking at him. She was reading the long, hard years etched there. She was assessing the truth of his words, the weight of his promise. She was 12 years old, but in that moment, she held the gravity of a woman making the most important decision of her life. The silence stretched on, filled only by the whisper of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire. Finally, she gave a single solemn nod. Her voice, when she spoke, was as clear and steady as his had been in the store. "We would want that," she said. She spoke for both of them. "We would want to be your daughters." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled him washed over Silas. He hadn't realized until that moment how terrified he had been that she would say no. He simply nodded back at her, unable to speak. In the warm, flickering lamplight of the small cabin, a family was formally born. 6 years passed. The wind still scoured the Wyoming high country, but it no longer sounded of emptiness to Silas. It was just the wind. The Miller cabin was a distant memory. Silas, with a loan from Jebediah that he had paid back in 2 years of hard work, had bought 160 acres of land a few miles outside of Jericho Springs. It was good land, with a creek that ran through it year-round. Together, he and Alara had built a proper house. It was not large, but it was solid, with wood floors, glass windows, and 2 bedrooms. Silas had built it with his own hands, the way Alara's father had built his soddy. But this house was built to last. The ranch was small, but it was theirs. They had a dozen head of cattle, a flock of chickens, and a small garden that Alara tended with the same fierce competence she had applied to everything in her life. She was 18 now, a young woman who was tall and self-possessed, with her mother's corn silk hair and the same clear, gray eyes that had challenged him by a woodpile all those years ago. She managed the ranch's finances, her ledger as neat and orderly as Croft's, but filled with the honest accounting of their shared labor. Maeve was 13, a girl filled with the laughter and life that had been so brutally suppressed in her early years. The frightened shadow was gone, replaced by a bright, curious young woman who loved to read the books Silas bought for her and ride the gentle mare he had given her for her 10th birthday. She had his name, they both did. They were the Miller girls no more, they were his. One evening in late summer, Silas and Alara stood on the porch of the house they had built, watching the sunset. The sky was awash in colors, deep orange, soft pink, and a bruised purple along the horizon. Maeve was inside, her voice a low murmur as she read aloud to herself by the fire. The familiar, comfortable silence stretched between them. "The south fence needs mending by the creek," Alara said, her gaze on the fields that rolled away from them. "A couple of the posts are loose. I'll see to it in the morning," Silas replied. He looked at her, at the capable young woman she had become. He could still see the determined 12-year-old girl in her, the child who had refused to be broken. He had given them a home, but they in turn had given him back his life. They had filled the hollow spaces inside him. They had given him a reason to stop drifting. He had found his purpose not in a place, but in the family he had chosen and who had chosen him back. "It's a good life, isn't it?" she asked softly, as if reading his thoughts. Silas looked out at the land, at the solid house, at the light glowing in the window. He thought of the 2 graves in Colorado, a pain that was no longer sharp but a dull, quiet ache of memory. He thought of the long, empty years that had followed, and he thought of the day he had seen a thin wisp of smoke and 2 small, desperate figures. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "It is. The greatest things in this life are not found, but built. They are not stumbled upon in the wilderness, but are constructed, piece by piece, with quiet work and honest hands. A home is not 4 walls, but the safety found in another's care. A family is not always a matter of blood, but of choice, the solemn, binding decision to stop for someone who has been left behind, and the courage to say, 'Ride up behind me.' It is the slow, deliberate act of mending what is broken, whether it is a child's doll or a man's heart, until what is built is stronger than what was lost.